Listen to the Tommy Shnurmacher Show, live weekdays 9 to noon on CJAD800 and CJAD.com.
Some shocking violence happening in Israel in the past few weeks. Is the situation going to get worse before it gets better? Philippe Assouline, a writer, lawyer, expert on international relations and Middle East politics, joins me now. Good morning.
Hi, good morning, Tommy.
Philippe, can you tell us a bit about what's going on in Israel at the moment and for the last few weeks?
Yes, thank you. So, without boring your listeners with too many details, there has been a wave of spontaneous or semi-spontaneous murder attacks or stabbing attacks on random locations within Israel and within the territories for a few weeks. It's carried out mostly by young Palestinians, sometimes very young teenagers, who are going around with knives or meat cleavers and stabbing random people at bus stops who are walking in the market. And it's been encouraged by, unfortunately, this is the tragic part, I consider some of these youngsters to be victims. They've been encouraged by Palestinian leadership and some clerics to do this. And it's come as a result of tensions on the Temple Mount, which we can go into detail if you want. But long story short, the Temple Mount is the holiest site in Judaism. It's a very holy site in Islam. And more Jews have been visiting it. And as a response, some paid Palestinian activists have been harassing the people visiting. And so the police ended up getting involved when Palestinian worshippers stockpiled, some Palestinian young men, actually, it's not such a huge group, but they stockpiled a lot of weapons on the mount to attack Jews at the Western Wall below during Rosh Hashanah. The police came in, it was seen as a desecration, and the incendiary speeches have been continuing such that every day there is between 5 and 25 attacks happening in what is a very small country.
There's a piece by Noah Feldman from Bloomberg News, and let me quote from it. He says, "From the Israeli perspective, Palestinians are randomly stabbing Israelis, after which Israel police or bystanders shoot the assailant to prevent further violence. From the Palestinian perspective, the shootings by Israelis are either unprovoked or disproportionate to the threats and therefore amount to extrajudicial killings." With those two views, where do you feel this situation is going to go next?
So the point that Israelis are jittery, if you can imagine not being able to wear headphones when you're walking around with your iPod for fear that you could be stabbed at any moment. I have a friend in Israel who I spoke to who walks around with oven cleaner to pick up her kids because she doesn't have a gun or a weapon. So the fact that Israelis are very jittery has led to any of these stabbers being shot down right away. There have been a number of them that have been killed after or in the act of stabbing. Now, the Palestinian Authority itself has what I think is an obscene strategy of casting terrorists, which it praises, as victims in English. It praises them in Arabic and casts them as victims in English. That said, this cannot continue. Israelis are afraid, a lot of people are armed, and there's already been mistakes made, friendly fire, quote, unquote. There's been an innocent person mistaken for a terrorist who was killed a couple of days ago. The level of fear is creating tension such that the police forces or even civilians will go too far. It is bound to happen.
Well, is this level of fear created in Israel seen as a success by its enemies?
Well, I can tell you what the Palestinian leadership has been saying, and this is tragic because they're being funded by the West. The Palestinian leadership has unapologetically been praising these attacks by children on children very often. Okay, we had an attack by a 13-year-old Palestinian boy who almost killed a 12-year-old Israeli boy on his bicycle. And they've been saying, Jibril Rajoub, a former head of Palestinian security, very prominent Palestinian leader, said this needs to become a national strategy. Mahmoud Abbas early on said we welcome every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem. Others are praising it as an intifada that can't be stopped, etc. So rather than calming things down within Palestinian discourse, this is being praised. The accusations that Israel wants to change the status on the Temple Mount are continuing, and there is no real effort to calm this down in terms of rhetoric. Now in practice, there is efforts to calm this down by the PA, apparently, in terms of arresting terrorists and things of that kind, but no encouragement to calm down, no soothing words, no calming words. On the contrary, more arsonism, more verbal demagoguery, and I think that is a big part of what is perpetuating this wave of violence.
Now, is it correct that there is a belief that Israel intends to exclude Palestinians from the Temple Mount and replace the Dome of the Rock because there are more Orthodox Jews than in the past who feel it permissible to pray on the Temple Mount? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate assessment. The Palestinians are obviously, it's a mixed bag, but there are leaders among the Palestinians who have been telling their people, both in Israel and in the territories, that Israel intends to change the status quo on the Temple Mount, to divide it into both a synagogue and a mosque. Others are saying they want to destroy the mosque to rebuild the third temple. This is a product of Jews praying more often on the Temple Mount. Not praying, sorry, they're not allowed to pray, but visiting the Temple Mount more often. It's also the product of rank demagoguery, of politicians saying irresponsible things to rally the people. Bear in mind, this is not new. Palestinian leadership, the more extreme side of Palestinian leadership, has been doing this since the 1920s. They've been using the excuse of the Al-Aqsa Mosque as a rallying point. In 1929, Haj Amin Husseini, the leader of the Palestinians, this was 20 years before the State of Israel was created, because Jews had put a bench at the Western Wall to help people pray, he accused them of wanting to destroy the Temple Mount, and there were riots where 133 people were murdered. 133 Jews, I believe, were murdered. So it's a rallying cry that seems to work. It doesn't seem to lose effectiveness, but it is, as you're saying, fueled by more eagerness on the part of Orthodox Jews to visit the Temple Mount, even though the numbers are still quite small, relatively speaking.
Now, so what does the Palestinian leadership hope to accomplish?
I'm not sure. There are different factions of the Palestinian leadership. So if you ask about Hamas, they have an incentive in creating conflict with Israel. That makes their stock go up. That's how they get money. They're in a very bad way recently because they've been cut off by Egypt. They're being pressured by the Saudis to stop it with the violence. So they have an incentive in any clash with Israel, and they've been encouraging this violence incessantly. Mahmoud Abbas has been under investigation for a number of reasons. He is in the 11th year of a 4 or 5 year term. He is accused of massive corruption. There have been billions of dollars of Western aid given that he has not accounted for.
Does the West not... Wait a second. Hold it. Does the West not know where the money's going? What do they do? Deliver the money in cash?
The West, essentially, if I had to summarize it, does not know where the money is going. It does not deliver the money in cash. Canada had, a number of years ago, started to put some conditions, but there's a vast amount of this money that the West cannot account for.
So would it
and not all the aid is from the West.
So would it
but
be...
a large sum of money is from the West.
Would it be correct to say, then, that the Palestinian people are really being given a disservice by their own leadership?
I think that is the safest thing to say. I would, in fact, ascribe, and this may be controversial, but I would ascribe the majority of Palestinian suffering to the choices of their leaders. The Palestinians now are casting this as an expression of frustration because of the occupation, riding roughshod over the fact that the Palestinian leadership has chosen to reject, in the last 15 years, 3 Israeli offers of statehood.
Right, but
wouldn't given them at the end, the later offers, virtually 100% of the territory they claim. So, yes, I think the Palestinian leadership is doing a disservice. It is inculcating hatred into its population. As I said, I see these young Palestinians carrying out these attacks as victims, and it is not building a future for them. It is taking satisfaction in symbolic victories, like boycotts of Israel, like flag raising at the UN, but not giving them anything concrete to improve their lives.
My conversation with Philippe Assouline, a writer, lawyer, and expert on international relations and Middle East politics, talking about the situation in Israel. I quoted you before from this piece by Noah Feldman that appeared in Bloomberg News, and he says that Israelis believe theirs is a democratic society in which the police enforce the law rather than break it. However, Palestinians think that Israeli security services shoot first and ask questions later. With these two viewpoints, where does this go next?
I think there's a fair criticism to be made of the Israeli government without removing any responsibility for the Palestinian side for inciting these youngsters to go kill and then treating them as victims, which, again, I think is deplorable. But the Israeli government under Netanyahu, in my opinion, has perfected paralysis. It talks a big game, but in any situation, really, what you have is a clinging to no action or very trivial symbolic action, which can be destructive, because it doesn't solve the problem. And so you've had civilians taking upon themselves the responsibility of protecting themselves and others. You've had people stopping terrorists with umbrellas, with rolling pins and things of that kind, and of course, with guns. A lot of people in Israel are armed because of the situation, and these people who are carrying these stabbing attacks are usually getting shot and killed. And again, I think if the government doesn't try to do something, and I'm at a loss for what could be 100% effective, but if it doesn't try to do something to calm the situation down, there will be more and more Israelis who, because of this all-encompassing fear, will act too hastily.
And
I think it's a legitimate concern. I think the Palestinian Authority is exploiting it in a despicable way, though.
So if the violence continues like this, is there a sense that when both sides get tired of this horrific violence, that there'll be more of an incentive to sit down for talks? I mean, you mentioned the Israeli view. Palestinians rejected past peace offers, several of them. The Palestinian view saying that continuing construction by settlers indicates that there's no real appetite by the current Israeli government for any peace deal anyway.
I think the negotiations need to happen for their own reasons. I would favor the path that is directed to the Arab League. If Israel were to start negotiations with the entire Arab League, I think Mahmoud Abbas himself, the Palestinian chairman, has no incentive to resume negotiations. The strategic environment for him is such that if he does nothing, pressure has been put on Israel. He gets symbolic victories. And if he were to agree to a peace agreement and Israel were to withdraw, as it did from Gaza in 2005, he would be taken over the next day probably by Hamas or other groups that could be funded by outside parties like Iran. He has no real incentive to embark on any serious negotiations. The Israeli government is one that was elected as a rejection of negotiations. People forget that Israelis, also have their responses to the political situation, and they've been faced with what has become almost an annual terrorism onslaught now, either by rockets or by stabbing attacks now. So the government now is the most right-wing there's been in a very long time, and the building is actually not as substantial as it has been at other times. The talking about it is huge. The rhetoric is wrong, and there's no real effort to speak in Arabic to the Arabic people, for example. I don't know why the Israeli government doesn't speak in Arabic to the Palestinian population.
It doesn't do that?
It
doesn't do that on a routine basis?
No, I mean, there's spokesmen who do it. They'll offer messages for, the Muslim holidays, things of that kind, and that does have an impact. And there are obviously covert and more overt relationships, but at a very high level, the diplomacy seems to be directed at Europe. This is something I've always had a problem with. Israel's in the Middle East, and it should be talking Arabic and using references that make sense to the people in the region. And I would definitely encourage the government to look at negotiations with the Arab League.
Philippe Assouline, my guest, writer, lawyer, expert on international relations and Middle East politics. What is the reaction from the other countries in the region to what's happening right now inside Israel?
So it depends on the country we're speaking about. The reaction of Jordan has been shameful. The King of Jordan is always concerned with protecting his own power. He has an official responsibility on the Temple Mount. They're the custodians of the Temple Mount. And instead of calming tensions, he's been condemning Israel for changing the status quo, which is entirely false and is the root of all this violence. Egypt has been much more reserved and much more cautious in its statements. The Egyptian government has been a stabilizing force insofar as the relationships between the Israelis and the Palestinians is concerned. It faces a lot of criticism for how it's dealing with dissent internally, but in this issue it's been more responsible. So really it depends on which country you're talking about, but generally the leadership, when it comes to this potent symbol of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount, are very, very averse to bucking the trend. And you have to understand the cultural dynamics where conformity, especially in times of crisis, is much more prized in the Middle East than it is here or in Canada, for instance. So there's a very big reluctance to speak out against it. That said, I'm encouraged by an increasing, though still small, number of Arab dissidents who are speaking forcefully out against this violence. There have been a few, and it's very encouraging to see.
Philippe Assouline, my guest, writer, lawyer, expert on international relations and Middle East politics. Hekmat sends us a text. He said, why does the Israeli government destroy the houses of the offenders? Parents are not responsible for what their children do. We wouldn't do that here with our criminals. He doesn't think that's a genuine democracy. What would you tell him?
I think it's an understandable criticism, but it's a completely different social context. This is actually, I believe, either a Turkish or a British law that precedes the State of Israel. It's definitely a law that the Jordanians had on the books. And the idea is to deter the terrorists, because the terrorists now are getting salaries, either they or their families are getting salaries from the Palestinian Authority for killing Jews while they're in jail or after they die. They're being glorified in the media. The families, at least outwardly, seem to celebrate these attacks very often. The idea is to deter the attacks by elevating the cost. The parents are innocent, but this is a society where politics are governed by family and clan structure. It's a topic not many people know about, but it is perhaps, in my opinion, much more than Islamism. It is the problem in the Middle East, much more. And so the idea is to deter them by putting a cost on their family. Does it work? There's a very big debate. The Israeli government has suspended these methods many times in the past. And so now it's being instituted again, maybe out of desperation, maybe out of a cosmetic measure. Maybe it works. The studies are there's a debate in the scholars regarding if this works. I believe personally if this works, it is unfortunate. There's an element there that's perhaps unfair, but I think life should take precedence, but only if that has a proven effect.
Thank you so much, Philippe Assouline, writer, lawyer, expert on international relations. You're listening to the Tommy Shnurmacher Show on CJAD. Stay with us.
News Talk Radio, CJAD 800, CJAD.com.